There is a bridge over the Cumberland River, about 4 miles southeast of Barbourville, Kentucky, that has no guardrails. It's 1 lane wide. It carries a county road that sees a few dozen cars a day. Locals drive over it without a second thought. If you saw it from the water, you'd guess it was just an old rural crossing, built cheap, kept up out of habit. It wasn't built for cars. It was built in December 1905 by a railroad company that was legally a fiction from the day it was formed. A Parker through truss, 210 feet across the main span, designed for coal trains climbing out of a hollow called Brush Creek. That railroad ran for less than 50 years. It was quietly bought by Southern Railway, dropped into bankruptcy, sold at public auction to a single Barbourville businessman, kept alive for another quarter century on Ford Model A car bodies fitted with steel wheels, and finally erased when its last mine closed in 1952. Salvage crews took every rail, every tie, every trestle they could reach. They left the bridge because it was already carrying a county road on the top deck, and pulling it down would have cost more than leaving it up. So it's still there, quietly doing the wrong job, for the last 73 years. The line it was built for started in 1902, and it wasn't really a railroad at all. By the end of this, you'll know 3 things. You'll know why a coal company in Warren, Pennsylvania, quietly reorganized itself as a railroad in the middle of July 1902, and why that single legal decision built 8 miles of track through some of the steepest country in Knox County. You'll know why the biggest railroad in the region, the Southern, bought it, dropped it, and let it slip into receivership within 20 years of finishing it. And you'll know why a man from Barbourville named James McDermott walked into a public auction in June 1924, put down a bid, and became the sole owner of an entire common carrier railroad, complete with locomotives, coaches, bridges, and every last mile of steel, at a moment when the whole coal industry was starting to slide. None of this was hidden. It just wasn't taught. To understand what happened here, you have to start with the ground itself. Knox County sits in the southeastern corner of Kentucky, deep in the coalfield that runs down through Appalachia into Tennessee. It was carved out in 1799 and named for Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War under George Washington. For most of the 19th century, this was farming and small-scale timber country, with coal known to be under the ground but hard to move to a market. In 1890, Knox County produced its first 80,000 tons of coal. By the early 1900s, the eastern Kentucky coalfield was pulling in serious money from outside the state, and one of the syndicates paying attention was based in Warren, Pennsylvania. That syndicate bought a large section of undeveloped coal land in Knox County, incorporating as the Cumberland Coal Company. The principal openings of their mines were approximately 9 miles from the Louisville and Nashville Railroad at Artemus. Artemus itself was a small station community, sitting on land that Artemus Herndon had given for the depot in 1888, 4 miles southeast of Barbourville along the Cumberland River. 9 miles of rough country lay between the L and N tracks and the seam the Pennsylvanians wanted to dig. They needed a way through those 9 miles, and here is where the ground rules of 1900s Kentucky start to matter. Under Kentucky law, railroads could more easily obtain rights of way than coal companies. As a result, the syndicate reorganized on July 15, 1902, as the Cumberland Railroad Company. On paper, they were no longer just a coal company, they were now a railroad. And with that piece of paper, they gained the legal ability to run steel across Brush Creek country, whether the neighbors liked it or not. Sit with that for a second. The reason a rail bed was cut through Knox County is not because someone in 1902 believed passengers or general freight needed to reach the Brush Creek hollows. It's because a group of investors needed a legal fiction to move their own coal, and Kentucky railroad law gave them the tool. That's what nobody owned, in a sense, not the ground itself, the premise. It was a coal spur wearing the clothing of a common carrier, and the day it stopped moving coal, its whole reason for existing dropped out from under it. You can walk the cut today, and you're walking a right-of-way argument dressed up as a railroad. Construction moved fast once the paperwork was clean. Work started south of Artemus, crossing the Cumberland River about 3/4 of a mile below the station at the mouth of Brush Creek. Engineers followed the creek up its narrow valley, cutting benches into the hillsides where the water bent, filling low spots with frame trestles. By December 1905, the main line ran 8 7/10 miles up Brush Creek to Lunsford. From Lunsford, the main track ascended Big Brush Creek for 1.5 miles to Wheeler. A branch line from Lunsford followed Tie Fork west to Anchor, spanning 2 7/10 miles. The centerpiece was that Parker threw truss over the Cumberland River with a 210-foot main span and an 89-foot approach trestle. Around it were 20 frame trestles totaling 1,998 feet. It was a small railroad by any measure, but the engineering was real. Within weeks of the line's completion, it changed hands. By late 1905 or early 1906, the Southern acquired the stock of the Cumberland Railroad. The L&N, which sat only 9 miles away and had every reason to want the coal traffic, showed almost no interest. Southern did. Southern had bigger plans. Its officials looked at the little Cumberland line running up Brush Creek and imagined extending it another 26 miles south over the ridge into Tennessee to reach a large undeveloped coal reserve near the town of Jellicoe. Some grading work was actually done for that extension. Traces of the ungraded roadbed can still be found in the hills south of Warren, but the extension was never finished. Two things stopped it. Financial trouble came first. The cost of acquiring the coal land and building even 8 miles of railroad had already stretched the original Pennsylvania syndicate thin. Layered on top of that came a legal fight with the L&N, which wasn't willing to see Southern build a competing coal outlet through country it considered its own. Court battles slowed construction. By 1908, the grading crews had gone home. The Jellicoe extension existed only on paper and in the shape of a few unused cuts in the woods. For about a decade, the little railroad worked as intended. Coal moved down from Warren and Wheeler and Anchor. Passenger trains ran between the coal camps and Artemus. By 1916, there were 3 daily round trips, except for Sundays when there were 2. Miners and their families used the trains for groceries, funerals, school, and doctor visits. The line paid its way, more or less, for as long as coal held. Then came the First World War, and after it, the collapse. After World War I, the coal business declined. Southern Railway allowed the line to go into receivership and bankruptcy. Coal prices dropped hard through the early 1920s. Mines closed. Freight shrank. Southern, which had never fully committed to this little spur in the first place, stopped propping it up. Nobody at the top of Southern's organization was interested in personally saving 8 miles of failing coal track in Knox County. On paper, the line still existed. In practice, it was drifting. That's the second version of nobody owned. A corporate orphan, still legally a railroad, running because inertia kept it running. On June 19, 1924, the line was sold to James A. McDermott of Barbourville, Kentucky, at public auction. He walked away as the sole owner of a common carrier railroad, and he renamed it, at the moment of purchase, the Artemus-Jellicoe Railroad. The name preserved the ambition of a railroad that had been imagined as a larger connection than it ever became. He kept the original ambition in the name, even though the Jellicoe extension had been dead for 16 years and everyone knew it. McDermott ran it on a shoestring. Old Southern Railway locomotives, numbers 142 and 177, were purchased for $3,500 and $4,000. 15-seat Ford Model A rail buses were used for passenger service. 2 trailer coaches from the street railway system in Knoxville, Tennessee, were also acquired. In 1930, the equipment was superseded with a 55-seat Brill-Mack rail bus purchased from the Pennsylvania Railroad. Think about what you're looking at. A railroad that started life as a Pennsylvania Coal Syndicate's legal end run, ran under Southern Railway's colors for a couple of decades, then ended up in the hands of a single man in Barbourville who was running passenger service on refitted Model A Ford bodies fitted with steel wheels. That's the shape the story takes when you follow it home. It doesn't go to a boardroom. It goes to a small-town office in Knox County, where one man is trying to keep steel on the ground with whatever second-hand equipment he can afford. For a while, it worked. The railroad kept moving coal from a camp that everyone eventually called KJ. That name has its own strange history. The original settlement in that hollow was called Lunsford, after Tarland Lunsford, who owned the land. A sawmill operated by C.A. Penland, who was also overseer of the Lunsford property, provided the main source of income. In 1928, Murat H. Davidson purchased from James A. McDermott of Barbourville a controlling interest in the Artemus-Jellicoe Railroad Company. He started prospecting the local Dean seam of coal in various places of the Lunsford area and brought in the Whitfields, Brian Sr. and Brian Jr. of Brookside, Kentucky, prominent figures in the coal industry, to examine the coal and to investigate the possibilities of a mining operation on the 3,000 acres of land then obtainable. The mine that grew out of that partnership was operated by the Kentucky Jellicoe Coal Company. Rennick's Kentucky place name work connects the KJ name to the Kentucky Jellicoe Coal Company, whose initials helped turn an older local name into a coal camp name. The letters K and J got spoken as KJ, and the name stuck. By the 1930s, there was a real coal camp there, with houses, a company store, and a rebuilt post office. You have to sit with the human layer here. The trains running up Brush Creek weren't running just to satisfy investors in Warren, Pennsylvania. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, they were carrying miners to work, kids to school, and families out of a hollow that had almost no other way out. Passenger service was small, sometimes ridiculous by mainline standards, but for the people living in KJ and Wheeler and Anchor, it was the road. Then the road changed, literally. Passenger service declined after a hard-surfaced road was completed in 1939. Passenger trains were discontinued in 1941. The Ford rail buses were pulled off the rails. If you wanted to leave KJ after that, you drove, or you rode with someone who did. The railroad had lost its people. All that was left was the coal. For a few more years, the coal held. The Kentucky Jellicoe mine kept working. Coal cars kept moving down Brush Creek to Artemus, over the Parker Truss Bridge, and out onto the L&N, but the ratio was shifting. Every year, less passenger revenue, less mixed freight, and more dependence on a single shipper, whose coal reserves were finite. In 1945, the branch from Lunsford to Anchor was abandoned. That was the first cut. Nearly 3 miles of track lifted, sold for scrap, gone. What remained was the main line up to Wheeler and the community around KJ. Then, on April 1, 1952, Kentucky Jellicoe notified the railroad that its mine was closing. That was the end. With no coal to move and no passengers to carry, there was no reason for the Artemus Jellicoe Railroad to exist. The Artemus Jellicoe Railroad applied for abandonment on June 3, 1952, received approval on July 29, stopped operating on November 1, and was dismantled by the end of March 1953. Salvage crews came in and pulled every rail and every tie. By the end of March there was nothing left but the roadbed, some empty trestles, and the big bridge over the Cumberland River. Which brings you back to where this story started. The bridge should have been scrapped like the rest. It wasn't, because the county road on the top deck already used it, and pulling it down would have cost more than leaving it up. So the tracks came off the top, the roadway stayed, and the Parker Truss kept doing a job it had never been designed to do. Even after 120 years, this narrow one-lane structure without guardrails remains in use, a rare and enduring relic of the region's railroad history. If you drive across it today, you're driving on the last visible piece of a railroad that started as a legal maneuver by a Pennsylvania coal syndicate, was quietly absorbed by Southern Railway, went bankrupt, was auctioned to a single Barbourville businessman, ran on refitted Ford Model A bodies, and finally died when its last coal customer closed. The rest of the line has been reclaimed. The right-of-way through Brush Creek is a scar in the hillsides, sometimes a farm lane, sometimes a footpath, sometimes just a stripe of unusually flat ground running through second-growth timber. In 2001, Kentucky had only around 2,780 miles of track, down from over 4,000 at its peak in the 1930s. That means the state has an astonishing 1,200 or so miles of abandoned railroad beds. Less than 1% were converted into recreational uses. The Cumberland and Artemus Jellicoe route is somewhere in that vast unmarked total. You can find it if you know what to look for. The bench cuts, the grade, the way water still bends around invisible fills, but almost none of it is signed. Almost none of it is on the standard tourist map of Kentucky. The record survives mostly in a single Railway and Locomotive Historical Society bulletin article by Elmer G. Sulzer, published in April 1963, a handful of local historians and the bridge. So follow the cut home. That's what the story really means. The line doesn't go to a lost civilization. It doesn't go to a suppressed government project. It goes exactly where the record says it goes. Up Brush Creek, past Trosper, past Bays, into a hollow that was named Lunsford, then KJ, and then almost nothing at all. It goes to a moment in 1902 when a group of investors realized they could reach coal faster by calling themselves a railroad than by calling themselves a mining company. And it goes to a moment in 1952 when a mine closed and took a railroad with it. Nobody owned this line the way a public railroad is supposed to be owned. It was a corporate instrument. Then it was an orphan. Then it was one man's private railway. And then it was gone. The bridge is still doing the wrong job. The cut is still there. The record is still there. You just have to know it was ever a railroad at all.